folks, welcome to the EDM studio. Today I'm going to be talking about the ESM synth, and what's really cool about this video is I feel like we now have all the background knowledge to understand what pretty much every aspect of this synth does. You've got signals and waveforms, you've got filters and cutoff frequencies, and you've got envelopes, and those are both filter and amplitude envelopes. So all those things should make sense now, and with that we can kind of dive into this and understand what all these things do. So there are really three sections to the ESM that I want to point out. The first is we've got the oscillator section here, and that's really what everything begins with. That's the initial waveform that we're going to be working with. Then the signal goes into the filter portion. So this is a low pass filter that we can use to shape the signal, and then finally it goes into an amplitude envelope. And there are two other items I want to point out. Those are glide and overdrive, and we'll talk about each of those as well. So let's begin with the oscillator section. The ESM is a single oscillator synthesizer, but it's capable of outputting either a sawtooth wave or a square wave or something in between. So you can hear what that sounds like. We've got the sawtooth wave and the square wave and everything in between. And you may have noticed that the square wave is an octave below the sawtooth wave. I think that's because the ESM is, at least in theory, based on an organ that you might hear in a church. So those are kind of the two primary waveforms that you'll hear from an organ that it's capable of generating. And that's actually what these things are. Now, I initially thought that these were the number of voicings, but it turns out that this is actually the pipe length of the organ. So you've got an 8-foot, 16-foot, and 32-foot pipe organ, and what those correspond to in practice is actually the octave selector. So a longer pipe generates a lower frequency, and that's why as you toggle these, the octave will change. And I had a little bit of glide on there, so this is what it sounds like discreetly. As you may have guessed, this glide knob, what this does is this is kind of the pitch bend between notes. So it's not directly related to the oscillator function, but it's kind of grouped in there for the purposes of the ESM. And so you can hear, like, if we have an interval like this, the higher the glide function, the more it will pitch bend. And if it's all the way down, then it just changes instantaneously. Okay, so that's the oscillator portion. Next, let's talk about the filter. And there are some things on here that should be familiar, like cutoff and resonance. And then there are some things that are not quite as familiar, and those are probably intensity and velocity. So here's the velocity knob, here's the intensity knob. The velocity knob, what that does is that basically increases or decreases the modulation rate of the filter based on how hard you press the key. So if you press the key hard, then the filter will clamp down more quickly than if you press it lightly. And the more you turn this knob to the right, the more of an impact that will have on the filter. The intensity is the depth of the modulation. So it's essentially how far does the filter move when you clamp down. And then the decay is the time decay of the filter. So it's how quickly does it go. So again, intensity is how far, decay is how quickly, and velocity is kind of how intense is that based on how quickly you press the key. And cutoff and resonance should be familiar. Cutoff is the point at which the low pass filter reaches the 3 dB mark, and resonance is the compensation for that fall off. So you get kind of a spike of frequency content around the cutoff frequency based on how intense the resonance is. So that's the filter. We can kind of play around with that, and it's probably too much to change these all at once, but you can kind of hear a few of these, particularly if we boost the resonance. You'll hear the low pass filter clamp down on the note. Okay, so we've got the cutoff frequency there, get some resonance going, and then turn up the decay. And it's really obvious there with such a high resonance, you can actually even see the filter clamping down. Now, you may have noticed that was kind of going, relatively slow. That's because I put the time decay so high, but if we put it lower, you get almost like a phaser-like sound to it. And if we increase the intensity, now it's really sweeping a large range, so it goes like choo kind of sound. So that's what that is. Okay, let's talk about the volume envelope. So we've got the basic volume knob. That should be pretty obvious what that does. That adjusts the amplitude, the output. The decay is the time decay of the amplitude envelope, and if we put that all the way down, you'll get almost like just a really quick pop, right? Because the signal is decaying really quickly in amplitude, and if we put it all the way up, you get a infinite sustain. So I could just sit here all day and the note will sustain forever. And if you put it somewhere in the middle, you get more of a pluck sound, or almost kind of bouncy, No, yeah, it sounds kind of electro there. And then velocity for the volume envelope is exactly the same thing as the velocity for the filter envelope. So basically, the harder you press the key, I can probably get. Let's see here if I can get it to. So you can hear there that when I press the note softly, the volume is impacted more, and I can actually kind of create a noise that's louder or softer depending on how hard I hit the key. And then the last interesting toggle here on the ESM is this overdrive function. And what you can think of that doing is, if you had a perfectly sinusoidal wave, if you ran this overdrive all the way to the right, what it's going to do is it's going to amplify the signal, and then it's going to clip off the tops of that wave. So if you imagine like this sinusoid, and then we chop off the top, you're amplifying the signal, and then you're clipping it at a certain height. What you're going to get, or a certain amplitude, what you're going to get is something that approaches a square wave. So long and short of it is, as you move the overdrive toggle to the right, you get something that approaches more and more a square wave, and it gives it that characteristic overdrive sound. So let's see what that sounds like. If I turn on the resonance, you'll probably hear it better. So it works like an overdrive, just like on a electric guitar when you get that really distorted sound. That's what overdrive is. Alright, so that is literally every parameter that you can tweak on the ESM. And this is a monophonic synth, so you can only play one note at a time, which kind of simplifies things as well. But I think what's really cool is, all of that should make sense. And if it doesn't, you can go back and watch my videos on, signals, filters, or envelopes. But it's a pretty basic synth, and with that knowledge, you should be able to listen to bass lines on your favorite tracks and kind of hear like, oh, I hear a little bit of a square wave there, or a little bit of resonance in the filter, or something that sounds like a pluck, and you can actually kind of reproduce or begin to reproduce sounds that you hear in music that you listen to actively. So I think that's enough for today, but we're making progress, so it's really cool to kind of dive into these things and understand them on a deeper level. So with that, we'll call it a day, and thanks for watching, and see you next time.